All right, this is your video for Monday's class where we're going to talk about making tables. Not this kind of table, our kind of tables. So a table is a tool that we can use to find and or organize our solutions for an equation. We can also use a table to help us create a graph. So we're going to do both of these things today. Make sure that you have your note sheet in front of you that I gave you when you were in class so that you can follow along, make good graphs, fill in the tables on there. So to make a table, we're going to plug in different numbers for x, then solve to find y using our equation. So here I have my table, and I'm going to plug in some numbers for x. This is already filled in on your note sheet. But I'm just going to pick 0, 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to solve to find y. So all I'm doing is I'm taking my value of x and plugging it into my equation. So I know that -2 times 0, and then I'm going to add 8. So -2 times 0 gives me 0, plus 8 equals 8. So that means that y is equal to 8 when x is 0. So this is a solution to my equation, 0, 8. So I'm using my table to help organize these solutions. I can also use this table to plot the point on my graph. So I have 0, 8 directly from my table, and I can plot that on my graph. So 0, 8. And I'm going to keep doing this for the rest of the numbers that I picked for x. So my next value is 1. I'm plugging that into my equation. So I have -2 times 1, and then I'll add 8. -2 times 1 gives me a -2, plus 8. That equals +6. That should be a plus. So I will have 6 for my y. And again, this is a solution. This is a point on our line, 1, 6. And I can plot that on my graph. And I'm going to keep going through these. So I'm plugging in 2 for x. That means I will have -2 times 2. Then I'm adding 8. So -2 times 2 is a -4. And I'll add 8 and end up with a +4. And I can plot that point on my graph. 2, 4, that's a solution to our equation. It's a point on the line. So 2, 4. And then my last value that I had for x was 3. So I'm going to plug that into my equation. So -2 times 3. And then I'll add 8. So -2 times 3 is a -6. Plus 8 gives me +2. So my point 3, 2 is a solution to my equation. It's in my table, and I can plot that on my graph. So my table is organizing the solutions to my equation, and it can help me create my graph because I can look at my table and see, okay, my points that I'm plotting are 0, 8, 1, 6, 2, 4, and 3, 2. And then I can draw my line through these points. And I want to make sure that I have arrows on both ends of my line. Just go through all my points, and I can continue that down as far as I need to. I could plot more points if I wanted to. Let me move my line, make it a little better. There we go. So there would be my graph, my line for y equals -2x plus 8. But your table does not have to begin at 0. Our last table, we started with 0 for our x. We went 0, 1, 2, 3. But it does not have to start at 0. And it does not have to go up by the same amount in the x column. On the last example, we went up by 1 every time. 0, 1, 2, 3. But we don't have to go up by 1 every time. So I could pick x values, my numbers for the x column, to be -4, -2, 1, and 3. So I'm not starting at 0, and I'm not going up by the same number every time. So first I go up by 2, then I go up by 3, then I go up by 2 again. So I'm going up by different amounts. But this still works. I can still find solutions, I can still organize them in the table, and I can still graph it. So let's find our values for y. I'm just taking my x, plugging it into my equation, and finding that other part of the solution. So I'll have -4 plus 4, and that equals 0. So my first solution that I'm putting in my table is -4, 0, which would be right there on my graph. Then I have -2. So -2 plus 4 gives me a 2. So my next solution in my table and my next point that I'm going to put on the graph is -2, 2. Then I have 1, x is equal to 1. So I'll have 1 plus 4, and that equals 5. So y is equal to 5 when x is equal to 1. So another solution would be 1, 5. Right there. And then my last one that I have in my table is when x is equal to 3. So I'll have 3 plus 4, which equals 7. So 3, 7 is another solution, another point on my line. So now I have 4 points on my line, 4 solutions that I've graphed, and I can draw that line through them. Just like that. All right, here is a strategy for dealing with fractions. If you have a fraction in your equation, here I have 1/3 x minus 1. So I can choose numbers for x that are multiples, which means that I'm taking the number and multiplying it. So they're multiples of the denominator. So I'm taking my number in the denominator, which here is 3, and I can choose numbers for x that are multiples of 3, meaning I'm taking 3 times 1, which is 3, 3 times 2, so 6, 3 times 3, so 9, and 3 times 4, which is 12. You could pick any other multiples of the denominator. But this is a strategy for dealing with fractions, because now when I plug in those values for x, I'll have nice numbers, I'll have integers to deal with rather than fractions. So if I plug in 3, I have y equals 1/3 times 3, and then I'll subtract my 1. 1/3 times 3 is equal to 1. And then I'll subtract 1, and I'll end up with y equal to 0. So that's a nice number. It's an integer, because I don't want to have to deal with my fractions. That's why I'm picking multiples of the denominator. So then my next value, I have x equals 6. So 1/3 times 6, and then I'll subtract 1. 1/3 times 6, I get 2 minus 1. And these are equal to y. So y is equal to positive 1. When x equals 9, I'll have 1/3 times 9, and then subtracting 1. So 1/3 times 9 is equal to 3. Minus 1, I'll get y equal to 2. So I'm getting integers, I'm getting nice numbers, whole numbers, rather than fractions. That's why we like to pick the multiples. And then my last point on here was x equal to 12. So I'll have 1/3 times 12, then minus 1. 1/3 times 12 is 4. Subtracting 1, I end up with 3. So I have my solutions in my table, all of my values for x and y. And I can plot them on my graph. Because remember, these are all solutions, so they're points on my graph, on my line. So I have 3, 0. I have 6, 1. And I'm going to run out of room. But 9, let's say 9 is here. 9, 2. And my 12 is off of my screen there. But we could pick other multiples. That would be negative. So I could pick like a -3 and plug that in and find some other points on my graph in the other direction. But 3 points is enough to draw my line. The more points that you put on your graph, the easier it's going to be to draw a straight line, because you'll have more points to help guide you and where you're going. So I've got my straight line there. If I had more points, it would be easier to draw my line. I would have a more accurate graph. So that is our strategy for dealing with fractions. Choosing numbers for x that are multiples of the denominator of whatever your fraction is. So here I had 1/3, so I picked multiples of 3. If I had 3/4, I would pick multiples of 4. All right, and then what do you do if your equation is not in slope-intercept form? You should convert it. Then from there, you can make your table and your graph and find solutions. So first we will need to convert this point slope form equation into slope intercept form. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can convert it on your own, and then you can check your work when you unpause the video. So pause the video now and try that. All right, so here is the worked out conversion from point slope form to slope intercept form. So I started with distributing the 3/4 to the x and the 4. Make sure you multiply by both of those. So I was left with 3/4 times x plus 3/4 times 4. And 3/4 times 4 is 3. And I showed a little step for that in black and red on the top right, in case you need help with that. And then my next step was to add or subtract the number on the left-hand side of my equal sign in order to get y by itself. So I added 1 to both sides, and I'm left with my equation in slope-intercept form. So I have y equals 3/4 x plus 4. And now I can use that to create my table. So again, I had y equals 3/4 x plus 4. And I'm going to use that to create my table. And since I have a fraction, I want my x values to be multiples of 4. Whatever the number in the denominator is, I want multiples of that number to make it easier for me when I'm graphing. So I'm just going to choose 4, 8, 12, and 16. But 12 and 16 aren't on my graph that I have. 12 and 16 are way over there. So instead of 12 and 16, I'm going to pick negative multiples of 4. So I can do 4 times -1, which would be a -4, and 4 times -2, which is a -8, because those are on my graph. So sometimes you might need to look at the scale of your graph. Okay, so then I'll have to find all my values for y. So try that on your own now. Pause the video, try to find your values for y, maybe graph them too, and see if you can draw your line. And then when you unpause, you can check your work. So go ahead and pause the video now. All right, here is the filled in table and the completed graph. So all of those points that we see in our table are solutions. And since they're solutions, they create the line, because all of our solutions to an equation are also on the line, on the graph. So that is all I have for you for this video, and I will see you in class on Monday with your completed notes ready for the homework check, which will be in the form of a mini video quiz.